On April 13, 1970, 200,000 miles from Earth, astronaut Jack Swigert heard a bang. Then came a second bang. Then the spacecraft began to shudder. Commander Jim Lovell looked at the instruments. The oxygen pressure in Tank 2 was dropping. Fast. One of the fuel cells was dead. Then a second. Lovell keyed the radio to Mission Control in Houston. "Houston," he said, "we've had a problem. 3 astronauts, 200,000 miles from Earth. Spacecraft systems failing in sequence. No way to land on the moon. No clear way home." What followed over the next 4 days was one of the greatest feats of improvised engineering and human determination in the history of space exploration. This is the story of Apollo 13.
Another world, sky.
Apollo 13 launched from Kennedy Space Center on April 11, 1970. The crew, Commander Jim Lovell, Command Module Pilot Jack Swigert, and Lunar Module Pilot Fred Hayes. Lovell was already a legend. He had flown on Gemini 7, Gemini 12, and Apollo 8, the first mission to orbit the moon. Apollo 13 was supposed to be his crowning achievement, the mission that put him on the lunar surface. The launch was routine. The first 2 days of the mission were routine. So routine, in fact, that the television networks declined to broadcast the crew's scheduled television transmission on the evening of April 13th. There simply wasn't enough drama to justify the airtime. That assessment would not age well. The mission had already experienced one significant change before launch. The original command module pilot, Ken Mattingly, had been exposed to German measles by a fellow astronaut. Mattingly had no immunity. 3 days before launch, he was pulled from the crew and replaced by Jack Swigert, his backup. Mattingly never developed symptoms. He never got sick, but he would play a crucial role in the days that followed from the ground. On the evening of April 13th, 55 hours and 54 minutes into the mission, a routine stir of the oxygen tanks triggered a fault in the wiring of tank number 2. The tank exploded. Before we continue, let's take a closer look at the spacecraft at the center of this story. The Apollo spacecraft. 2 modules working together as one system. The command module, Columbia. The crew's living quarters and the only part designed to return to Earth. Roughly cone-shaped, 11 feet tall, 12 feet wide at the base. Room for 3 astronauts, barely. The service module, the cylindrical section attached to the rear of the command module, containing the main engine, fuel cells, oxygen tanks, and the electrical power systems that kept the crew alive. It was inside one of those oxygen tanks, tank number 2, that something went wrong on April 13, 1970. The lunar module, Aquarius, originally designed to land 2 astronauts on the moon, now repurposed as a lifeboat for 3 men who needed it to survive long enough to get home. The lunar module had enough oxygen for 2 people for 2 days. 3 people needed it for 4. Now, let's get back to our story. In Houston, Flight Director Gene Kranz heard the words from Lovell and immediately understood that something was seriously wrong. Over the next few minutes, the scope of the problem became clear. The explosion had ruptured Tank 2 completely and damaged Tank 1. The service module was venting oxygen into space. The main engine could not be used. The fuel cells that generated the spacecraft's electricity were dying. The command module had perhaps 15 minutes of battery power remaining before it went dark. The mission to the moon was over. The question now was whether the crew could survive long enough to get home. Kranz's team at Mission Control, engineers, flight controllers, specialists in every system on the spacecraft, began working the problem. They worked the way they always worked, methodically, without panic, one system at a time. The first decision was to power down the command module almost completely, preserving its battery power for re-entry, which was still 4 days away. The crew would move into the lunar module, Aquarius, and use it as a lifeboat. It was a solution no one had practiced. The lunar module had been designed to support 2 people for 2 days on the lunar surface. It now had to support 3 people for 4 days in deep space. Across the country, Americans who had grown tired of routine moon missions were suddenly riveted. The whole world was watching. The crew had problems that went beyond power and oxygen. Carbon dioxide was building up in the lunar module. The scrubbers that removed CO2 from the air were designed for 2 people. With 3 aboard, they were becoming overwhelmed. Within hours, the CO2 levels would reach dangerous concentrations. The lunar module used round CO2 scrubber canisters. The command module had square ones. On the ground, engineers at Mission Control gathered the exact items available to the crew: plastic bags, cardboard, tape, the cover of a procedure manual, and improvised a connector that would allow square canisters to fit into round holes. Then they read the instructions to the crew over the radio. It worked. Temperature inside the lunar module dropped to near freezing as systems were powered down to conserve electricity. The crew wore their spacesuits for warmth. They were cold, exhausted, and dehydrated. Water rationing had been imposed immediately. Meanwhile, on the ground, Ken Mattingly, the astronaut pulled from the crew 3 days before launch, spent hours in a simulator working through the procedures for restarting the command module after 4 days with no power. A procedure that had never been done, that no one was certain was possible. He got it right. On April 17th, the crew transferred back to the command module. They jettisoned the service module, and for the first time, saw the damage. An entire panel had been blown away. Wiring, tanks, and internal structure were exposed to space. Lovell looked at it through the window. "There's one whole side of the spacecraft missing," he reported to Houston. Minutes later, they jettisoned Aquarius, the lifeboat that had kept them alive. There was no way to bring it home. "Farewell, Aquarius," said Mission Control, "and we thank you." The command module hit the atmosphere at 25,000 miles per hour. The parachutes deployed. On April 17, 1970, Apollo 13 splashed down in the Pacific Ocean. All 3 crew members were alive. NASA called Apollo 13 a successful failure. The moon landing never happened. The scientific objectives were never achieved. By the original definition of success, Apollo 13 failed. But the crew came home, and that outcome, against the odds that had existed on the evening of April 13th, was something close to a miracle of engineering and human determination. The investigation that followed found the root cause: faulty insulation on wiring inside Oxygen Tank 2, damaged during a ground test years earlier and never repaired. When the tank was stirred, the damaged wiring arced, ignited the oxygen, and the tank failed catastrophically. Changes were made. Procedures were revised. Future missions carried an additional water supply, better battery reserves, and a 3rd oxygen tank isolated from the others. Apollo 14, 15, 16, and 17 all flew successfully. Jim Lovell never returned to space. Apollo 13 was his last flight. He had been closer to the moon than almost any human being in history and came home without landing. He has said in interviews over the decades since that he has no regrets. "The mission," Lovell said, "was a great learning experience, and we brought everybody home." 200,000 miles from Earth, on the evening of April 13, 1970, a spacecraft failed in a way that should have been fatal. What followed was 4 days of improvisation, determination, and teamwork between 3 exhausted men in a freezing spacecraft and a room full of engineers who refused to give up. They fixed problems with cardboard and tape. They restarted a spacecraft that had been cold and dead for 4 days. They navigated home using the stars, and they made it. Apollo 13 is remembered not as a disaster, but as a demonstration of what human beings are capable of when failure is not an option and going home is the only acceptable outcome. If you'd like to support this project, the link is in the description below. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one. We'll see you on the next flight.